Good afternoon and welcome to this week's update from Your Future Strategy. This week I want to look at two main areas. The first area is where we're at economically based on the COVID-19 virus, and secondly some of the proposed changes and how they affect property investors in Queensland and how you can have a voice in some of the proposed changes. So let's first look at the economy, and in particular, whilst there's a lot of headlines that have got some negative press around going into a recession and some fear as to what that may mean for us all in the long term, there are a couple of positives to take out of where we're at the moment, and they are the two areas that I wanted to look into today. The first one is this graph here, which demonstrates the cumulative confirmed cases of COVID-19 in Australia. And why this is positive is because, as you can see, and you may have seen this through updates from the federal and state governments, you can see that the number of cases that are being confirmed each day is flattening out. And what that means is that we're nearing the top of the bell curve. So if this continues the way that the modelling is being put together, you can imagine that this will mirror to following a downward trend on the other side. So based on the fact that we've now 6 weeks to 7 weeks from the beginning of that curve to where we are today, assuming we're getting relatively close to the peak of that curve, it means that we should start to trail out the other end of it within another 6 to 7 weeks or towards the end of May. Which is quite positive for all of us. I guess the challenge, which is what the government are trying to assess at the moment, is how do we safely come out of the restrictions and quarantine that we're currently in so that we don't see number of cases escalate. But the positive note to take out of this is that we can see from this graph that if we continue to follow the trend that we're expecting, we are going to start to see some blue sky out the other side of this, which means that we can start to understand how the economy will start to recover. The second slide that I wanted to show you relates to concerns that a lot of people have got over the level of debt that the country is borrowing to fund a lot of the assistance packages that are available. And whilst it sounds like an extremely large amount of money that is being pumped back into the economy through these assistance packages, if we look at it relative to GDP for Australia, what you'll see on the right-hand side there is that it shows from 2001, 2008, and 2019 how much debt we had as a percentage of GDP. So our GDP is $1.9 trillion, almost $2 trillion. And what you can see there with that green column is that we're expecting the gross government debt to rise to almost $1 trillion by the time all of these packages and assistance programs have been funded. But that only equates to about 50% of GDP, or basically the country's turnover. So, of course, the country doesn't need to repay all of this debt all at once. It can be paid off over years. And so I know there's a lot of concern from people I'm talking to that this is going to take years and our kids and generations after us will be paying for this. But it's actually not as bad as some other countries that were already heavily indebted prior to this. So you can see as an example, the United States, their debt levels are now 100%, or their borrowings are equal to their GDP or the country's turnover. So double basically what we are in Australia. So from that perspective, I guess one other positive note to take out of this as well is that we are in a very low interest rate environment globally. So if there was a time to borrow funds to do these sorts of things, it's certainly the cost of those borrowed funds is a lot lower than perhaps what they would have been, for example, after GFC. And so possibly even 3 to 4 times more expensive post-GFC as they are now. So on that basis, our ability to repay the principal, not just the interest, obviously is a lot better than it would have been after GFC. Turning now, I wanted to give an update in relation to some proposed changes for investors with rental properties in Queensland. These are announcements that came through from the Queensland government. They're inconsistent with what has been released by the National Cabinet and the federal government, and has caused quite some concern for property investors in Queensland. So I'm going to run through the changes they're proposing and why we don't feel that it's a balanced um, scenario or balanced reform for both owners and tenants. The first is that we know that there was a national cabinet, federal government announcement that there's a moratorium on evictions, both residential property and commercial property, for 6 months. And whilst we see this as reasonable, as long as there's a framework for negotiating arrangements that are fair for both a tenant and a landlord. So moving forward with the other proposed changes, what Queensland have put forward, and they announced this last Thursday, was that rather than deferring rental payments on residential property, it would be a waiver. So basically, there's no requirement for a tenant to repay any reduction in rent. Basically, the landlord has to forego that rent. Unfortunately, they've also said that the tenant is not required to provide any proof of that financial hardship to an owner. And whilst we understand that there's privacy concerns, we also think that it's reasonable and in good faith that each party should disclose their position. So we think it's not unreasonable for us to request documentation that confirms that they're actually in hardship, not that they're just telling us that they're in hardship. Unfortunately, because the way they've structured this to say that rental payments will be waived rather than deferred, it means that rent is no longer recoverable, and therefore, unfortunately, landlord insurance policies, whilst we believe this is a safety net for clients, is no longer available because the landlord insurer has no ability to recover lost rent from a tenant. So unfortunately, the proposed changes would not allow us to assist our clients like yourself to actually recover any lost rent. There's also an automatic 6-month lease extension. So if the tenant has the end of their lease within the 6-month COVID-19 period, they can elect to automatically extend the current lease by 6 months without consent from the owner. So you don't need to approve it. They simply can extend without your approval. Now, if they have already agreed or come to an agreement to reduce the rent and have it waived, that extension is based on those terms. So in worst case scenario, if somebody were to reduce the rent now, they would have 6 months of a reduced waived rental amount, and then a further 6-month extension at that lower amount, which to us seems a heavy burden on you, the client, rather than sharing that with the tenant. The tenant can also refuse entry to the property. Now, as we've earlier said, we'd already moved to conducting routine inspections virtually. The way that this has been proposed, without any basis, the tenant can also refuse to participate in doing those virtual routine inspections with us. So we think this is completely unreasonable. We do understand that if there are health concerns, we would need to be sensitive to those and work a solution around that, but we don't think it's reasonable that they could refuse entry without providing any grounds. And the tenant can also, if they choose to, break their lease with 7 days notice. And if it's a fixed term lease, they can still break it with 7 days and are only required to pay the maximum of 1 week's rent for breaking the lease. So this is completely in favour of the tenant and the whole concept of having a fixed term lease, so that you know with certainty that you have a tenant in for a period. Under normal circumstances, of course, the tenant would be responsible for any rent until a new tenant is found. Under the proposed arrangements, they would only be responsible for 1 week's rent. Thankfully, we're an accredited agency with the Real Estate Institute of Queensland, and as an advocate, they've done an enormous amount of work since this announcement came out, and have been incredibly vocal have got a lot of publicity behind how biased and unfair these proposed changes are, especially in context if you compare them to the other states and territories in Australia. And so the Premier is set to hold a sitting in Parliament on Wednesday next week. The REIQ have put together some open letters for owners of residential investment property to forward through the Premier. I have included a link within this email correspondence to you that allows you to have a voice. We certainly support you and are doing everything we can, but we also think if you could add some weight and also send through those letters, hopefully the 600,000 owners of residential real estate will be listened to when Parliament sits next Wednesday. Finally, just an update on property management and what we're doing with your tenants. At the moment, as well previously updated, we're calling every single tenant that we have, reaching out to your tenant to understand their position, but primarily also to provide assistance to them. In some cases, there are people completely confused about what assistance packages apply to them, how do they go about obtaining them. So we see, with the range of services that YFS has on offer, we're here to assist your tenant in ensuring that they get all of those cash flow and assistance packages so that they're in a position so they can continue to pay your rent. So we're reaching out to them to talk to them about their circumstances, how we can help them. And in most cases, that's at no cost to your tenant. It's simply to get you as an owner and your tenant and our organisation through what's a difficult time for all of us. So far, that process has been really well received, and the feedback that we've had from tenants has been really positive. So as we're calling through, if we haven't spoken to you already, we will be in contact with you to let you know the circumstances of your tenants. Lastly, just the usual disclaimer, the information that is contained within the presentation or update that I've provided today is just information that's been obtained and collated from public sources. You would need to see how it applies to your individual circumstances, and of course, YFS as an organisation is always here to do that and give you tailored advice to your own circumstances. That's it from me this week. I hope you all had a safe and happy Easter last weekend, and look forward to having what's no doubt going to be a quiet indoor weekend again this weekend.